There's nothing like a catfight among the sisterhood to expose feminism's bizarre rules. That's my subject on today's Fiamengo File. I'm Janice Fiamengo of the University of Ottawa. Recently, there have been wild accusations of violence and harm and groveling apologies at a feminist philosophy journal over their decision to publish an article by a feminist philosopher named Rebecca Tuvel. The article was called In Defense of Transracialism, and as its title indicates, it argues that society should treat transracial people with the same acceptance that it is now considered generally right to give transgender people. For making that argument, Tuvel was denounced by hundreds of feminist academics, one of whom called her out for, quote, egregious levels of liberal white ignorance and discursive trans-misogynistic violence. Now, there are too many twists and turns to cover everything, but let me offer a recap and highlight a few points in this story of lunatic meanness and cowardice. In Defense of Transracialism was published in the spring 2017 issue of Hypatia, a journal describing itself as a, quote, forum for cutting-edge work in feminist philosophy. Philosophy is, of course, an ancient discipline that asks such questions as how we know what we think we know and how we define concepts like goodness, justice, being, and truth. Hypatia is named for the 4th century Greek female mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher Hypatia of Alexandria. Unfortunately, feminist philosophy, as revealed in this incident, is something Hypatia herself would likely have found repellent. The journal's homepage states rather ominously that, quote, Hypatia's commitment to the development of feminist philosophy entails that in all its policies and practices, Hypatia actively reflect and engage the diversity within feminism itself, the diverse experiences and situations of women, and the diverse forms that gender takes across the globe, end quote. Diversity is one of those feminist buzzwords that means the opposite of what it says, having very little to do with genuine differences of perspective and everything to do with a rigid protocol of who's permitted to say what. Tuvel's paper was impermissible, essentially because it was written about race by a white woman who didn't pay the necessary homage to black female scholars, and also raised awkward questions about trans identities and privilege. At the beginning of her paper, Tuvel introduced the much criticized Rachel Dolezal, the young woman who was head of the Spokane, Washington chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, until it was discovered that both her parents are white, not black, after which she was forced to resign amidst a lot of public criticism. Tuvel compares Dolezal's case with that of the much more sympathetically received former athlete Caitlyn Jenner, who was generally applauded when she appeared on the cover of Vanity Fair magazine in her new incarnation as a woman. So why is there growing acceptance that Jenner is a trans woman when there is almost no acceptance that Rachel Dolezal is a trans black? This is the question Tuvel pursued. She concluded that, quote, if some individuals genuinely feel like or identify as a member of a race other than the one assigned to them at birth so strongly to the point of seeking to transition to the other race, we should accept their decision to change races, end quote. So to clarify, Tuvel is definitely not a right-winger. Not that there is anything wrong with that. She is, as far as I can tell, a card-carrying, social constructionist leftist feminist who accepts concepts like white privilege and gender equity. She uses politically correct phrases such as assigned at birth, as in the above quotation. Like most feminists, she rejects biology as the basis of identity. She accepts feminist claims about male privilege, At one point in her essay, in fact, discussing potential ethical objections to Dolezal's claim to be black, she argues that, quote, men exercise male privilege when they get more jobs as philosophy professors, yet we do not thereby suggest that we get rid of philosophy professors. Rather, we try to address gender inequality so that more women are represented in the discipline. Well, I don't think that's logical at all. It is not a case of privilege if men, quote, get more jobs. Do they really? It's only a privilege if they get the jobs because they are male, and likewise gender equality is not necessarily served by promoting women on the basis that they're women. Well, I suspect that Rebecca Tuvel and I would agree on almost nothing regarding the principles of feminism, but that doesn't change the fact that she deserved an appreciative academic response, a rigorous one perhaps. She didn't deserve the lynching, transracial metaphor intended, that she received. Well, Tuvel is no dummy, and nor is she ignorant of transgender theory. She justified her choice of subject by saying that she wasn't judging Dolezal's particular claim to be black. Instead, she was following transgender theorist Susan Stryker's advice to, quote, hold open a space. Academics are always talking about metaphorical spaces. To hold open a space for real intellectual curiosity, for investigations that deepen our understanding of how identity claims and processes function, rather than rushing to offer well-formed opinions based on what we already think we know. Aside from the somewhat pompous and grammatically garbled language, this would seem a perfectly legitimate philosophical aim. I won't go into all the details of Tuvel's argument, in which she considers 4 basic objections to transracialism. I encourage you to read her article, which is a surprisingly jargon-free discussion of what it means socially to transition to an identity different from what one was born into. To provide a flavor of her style, here's how she deals with the objection that Dolezal's act of claiming to be black was actually an illustration of white privilege. She responds, it is difficult to see how giving up one's whiteness and becoming black is an exercise of white privilege. Rather, it seems like the ultimate renunciation of white privilege, if by white privilege we understand an unearned system of advantages conferred onto white bodies. This is pretty politically correct stuff, but it skirts the politically incorrect. And this is why I think Tuvel might have fallen afoul of the ideology police. Because what Tuvel doesn't say, and had no intention of saying, I should make clear, but this is what is gestured towards, is the fact that Dolezal's choice to become black raises questions about the whole idea of privilege. If a white woman prefers to be black, doesn't that at least raise the possibility that in certain contexts and certain social settings, there's such a thing as black female privilege? Just as the fact that more men than women decide to transition may well suggest that there's such a thing as female privilege. I wonder if the problem with Tuvel's article was not that it was offensive in itself, which it certainly wasn't, but that its exploration opened the door to a range of ideas that many social justice activists don't want explored. But regardless of what one thinks of transitioning to a different race or gender, the impression one receives from reading Tuvel's paper is of someone following a line of reasoning. And this is what the practice of philosophy is supposed to involve. If Tuvel mischaracterized relevant scholarship or failed to consider counter-arguments, other scholars can take the opportunity to correct her. So, no biggie. It's really hard to square the content of Tuvel's article with the shockwaves it provoked. Literally hundreds of academics wrote an outraged open letter to the editors of Hypatia, insisting that the harm of the article was so great that only a retraction, a full apology, and a sweeping transformation of the journal's vetting procedure, how it is that they decide to publish certain articles, only all of that could properly respond to that harm. Now, what was the source of the harm? the letter writers wouldn't say, except to insist that as a cisgender white woman, Tuvel took liberties to which she was not entitled. They say, quote, "A message has been sent to authors and readers alike that white cis scholars may engage in speculative discussion of these themes without broad and sustained engagement with those theorists whose lives are most directly affected by transphobia and racism," end quote. To put it simply, if you're white and you want to, quote, "engage in speculative discussion about anything to do with race," you can do so only if you defer to the appropriate black scholars. Now, when it comes to the content of the article, the open letter alleges that there are supposedly glaring problems, but they produce a list of only 4, which turn out to be mostly errors of propriety or protocol rather than of fact or logic. And I want to go through them as quickly as I can because it is really shocking to think that hundreds of academics thought it fit to publish this list of supposedly catastrophically serious problems, which turn out to be almost nothing at all. Correct me if I'm wrong as I go through them. The first problem, presumably one of the most serious since they put it first, is that Tuvel's article uses the wrong vocabulary. They say it, quote, "uses vocabulary and frameworks not recognized, accepted, or adopted by the conventions of the relevant subfields." For example, the author uses the language of transgenderism. Apparently this isn't a popular term, although there are no obvious preferred ones. And it engages in dead naming a trans woman. In other words, it mentions that Caitlin's former name was Bruce, as if anyone anywhere in the universe wasn't aware that Caitlyn Jenner was formerly named Bruce. These misnamings, if they are that, have almost nothing at all to do with the substance of the argument. Using the wrong terms might indeed hurt Tuvel's reputation with other transgender and critical race scholars, but it is not at all clear how that could harm communities affected by transphobia and racism, since Tuvel is obviously supportive of these communities. And if the number one reason to claim that the article is noxious is that it was written by someone not entirely familiar with the naming conventions in the subfield, well, this is at most a very minor fault. Now, the second purported problem in Tuvel's article is that, quote, "it mischaracterizes various theories and practices relating to religious identity and conversion." For example, the author gives an offhand example about conversion to Judaism, end quote. This sounds like a serious criticism, especially if Tuvel mischaracterized various theories, but it simply isn't true. Tuvel barely mentions religious identity and conversion. The subject takes up only part of one paragraph, 120 words, in an 8,000-word article. The matter of conversion to Judaism is very briefly related. It's brought into the article to make the quick point that conversion involves both self-identification, in this case, self-identification as Jewish, and also acceptance by the community, in this case, acceptance by a rabbi in the Jewish community. It doesn't detract from the central argument, and it is definitely not, as far as I can tell, a mischaracterization. The third identified problem is that Tuvel's essay, quote, misrepresents leading accounts of belonging to a racial group. For example, the author incorrectly cites Charles Mills as a defender of voluntary racial identification, end quote. Okay, this also sounds very serious, and again, as far as I can tell, it is totally unfounded. Let's look at the exact statement by Rebecca Tuvel in relation to Mills. It as follows, Mills. Here it is. Charles Mills identifies at least 5 categories generally relevant to the determination of racial membership, including self-awareness of ancestry, public awareness of ancestry, culture, experience, and self-identification, end quote. Clearly, Tuvel is not saying that Mills is a, quote, defender of voluntary racial identification. She says that Mills lists self-identification as one component of racial membership. So the writers of the open letter are either deliberately misrepresenting what Tuvel said, or they're such poor readers that they can't tell what she said. And finally, the fourth reason for the terribleness of the article is that, quote, it fails to seek out and sufficiently engage with scholarly work by those who are most vulnerable to the intersection of racial and gender oppressions, women of color, in its discussion of transracialism. Now, this is a version, I think, of the logical fallacy of appealing to authority. It's not clear which scholars these are that Tuvel should have mentioned, or how engaging with them would have improved or changed her argument. At worst, this is an error of omission, if it really is, rather than of commission, but it really isn't clear that it is such an error. Certainly what the criticism tells us is that identity politics, who you are, not what you say, has entirely overtaken this branch of feminist philosophy. If you're a white cisgender woman, you'll be attacked for being a white cisgender woman. So in sum, the 4 problems identified by the open letter turn out to be insubstantial at best. Now, a delicious irony about this whole affair is that the open letter itself, full of outrage, full of righteousness, it itself came in for criticism for its own white cisgender privilege. A PS actually had to be added to the letter on May 1st at the 520th signature, apologizing for the letter's failure to engage appropriately with Black issues. This is what they had to say, quote, "We acknowledge that this statement should have named anti-Blackness directly. We thank Chanda Prescott-Weinstein and others for pointing out the dangerous erasure of anti-Blackness and the erasure of the Black labor on which the rhetoric of our own letter is built." End quote. This moment in the controversy is classic. No matter how high on their high horse the letter writers felt they were in criticizing Hypatia for publishing an article with unacknowledged white cisgender privilege, there's always an even more racially sensitive person, in this case, the lofty Chanda Prescott-Weinstein, and check out her online profile, by the way. There's always somebody more racially sensitive willing to call out the writers of the letter for their unacknowledged white cisgender privilege. Touché. So this was the letter sent to the editors of the journal, Hypatia. Now, one would hope that smart people reading this letter with its demands for apology and its instructions to the editors about what statements they must issue, what steps they must take, and so on, you'd hope that smart people would say, well, thank you for your letter. Although we decline to follow your dictates, we do invite all of you to submit cogent follow-up articles to Professor Tuvel's piece. And if your articles are more accurate, more substantial, and more logically rigorous than this open letter, we will consider publishing them. But of course, they didn't. Perhaps the long list of hundreds of big-name signatories just cowed the Hypatia editors, or at least a majority of them. This majority then posted a profound apology on the Hypatia Facebook page in which they, quote, recognize and mourn the harms of the article in agonizing, embarrassing detail with repeated promises to do better in future. And not only do they make no attempt to defend the article or their decision to publish it, they even say that the vicious attacks on Rebecca Tuvel for, quote, perpetuating harm were, quote, both predictable and justifiable, end quote. Amazing. I won't read the apology here, but I urge you all to take a look at this remarkable act of cowardice. To conclude, a couple of lines in the self-flagellating disquisition caught my eye. At one point, the editors attempt to justify what they call an error in the review process, which became a convenient deflection of blame because it allowed them to assign primary responsibility for the publication of the article to the 2 anonymous reviewers. In describing the review process, the editors explain that, quote, the journal has had a long-standing policy of minimizing desk rejections due to its commitment to providing constructive feedback to feminist scholars. So the suggestion here, I'm not sure exactly what they meant, but I think the suggestion is that unlike some more competitive or selective journals that routinely reject a large number of articles right from the beginning, Hypatia apparently has operated on the feminist principle of providing a supportive academic environment for feminist scholars and, helping them to improve their work. This is pretty amazing, this notion that Hypatia is a special journal, a special feminist journal that mentors and supports feminist scholars, stated even while the editors are busy throwing a feminist scholar under the bus. Well, it provides a wonderful example of feminist hypocrisy. Sure, they'll mentor you, but if something you say provokes outrage, you're definitely on your own. Further ironies are evident in their celebration of Hypatia's commitment to marginal forms of feminist theoretical work. This is what they say. Hypatia is a journal committed to pluralist feminist inquiry and has been an important site for the publication of scholarship long considered marginal in philosophy. Too many of us are still characterized as not real philosophers by non- and anti-feminist colleagues, end quote. Well, did the Hypatia editors really think that this poor me reference was going to encourage their critics to forgive them? The reference reminds us of the dangers of embracing feminist marginality for its own sake. When you embrace the marginal as sacrosanct, there's always somebody more marginal than you, someone who will call you out on the fact that you're not nearly marginal enough. The editors can apologize as much as they want, praise and thank their critics for their vitriol, ward off blame, promise to do better, sell out the person whose work they publish, and so on. But one thing will remain, and they've just essentially admitted it. They're not real philosophers. They're not dedicated to argument and the practice of logic. They're practitioners of identity politics, and that is and always will be a brutal blood sport. This is why feminist studies must die, because it ruins everything it touches.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please support us on Patreon. If even half of our subscribers gave us $1 per month, we'd be well on our way to creating more and better content. And don't forget to subscribe to us on Studio Brule.